Welcome everybody to Rivington Place. Welcome Rustom Bharucha. We're delighted to have Rustom here this afternoon. Rustom, as many of you know, is a director, dramaturg, theorist in performance art, and also the writer of several books, including In the Name of the Secular, The Politics of Cultural Practice, and the book which relates to the lecture today, which is Another Asia. Rustom is a professor at the School of Art and Aesthetics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, which is, I think, one of the more interesting places for discussing contemporary visual and performative culture in India. And I first met Rustom about 2 or 3 years ago in Berlin, and we had a conversation about Tagore. I think that was the first time we met. And I've been previously working on several projects that related to Tagore, and had a conversation with Rustom in which we talked about the possibility of really focusing on his work and his legacy. And then I read Rustom's book, Another Asia, which was, for me, the first time that I'd experienced literature which sort of met my own interest in this figure. Because I have to say that it's a very idiosyncratic take on Tagore. Interesting in terms of some of the things that you pick up on. For example, Tagore's sartorial statements through his dress, and in particular his relationship with the curator Okakura Tenshin, Japanese curator who worked during the same period, and who come across as these two cosmopolitan characters who formed this friendship in the early part of the 20th century. But the book also opens out into broader questions of cosmopolitanism, friendship, questions of the universal, and these are all addressed in the book very interestingly. And when we decided at Iniva and Goldsmiths to set up a research group funded by the AHRC to look at Tagore's legacy, which is called the Tagore Pedagogy and Visual Cultures Research Network, we invited Rustom to become a sort of honorary member of our group. And we made a visit to Shantiniketan earlier this year, and Rustom gave a 2-day seminar in Shantiniketan to members of the group, to faculty and to students. And I think that some of the things that came up during that 2-day lecture, as well as research from his book, will be the basis for today's lecture. So I want to welcome you, Rustom, and hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, the title of this talk is Performing Asia. My background is in performance, and the affective affinities of Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura Tenshin. So, let me begin by sharing a story which gets to the very heart of the central theme that runs through my lecture: affect. Instead of trying to define this nebulous word, which can be rendered both as a noun, the affect of something, or as a verb, I'm affected by something, it can also be heard as the effect of something, the consequence of something, I will let the story evoke the multivalent registers of the word. The story is attributed to the German playwright Karl Zuckmayer, who had fought in the First World War. One of his Indian friends, a German doctor, had to amputate the leg of an Indian prisoner of war. The doctor and the prisoner had no language in common, and there was a total impasse in their communication. Technically, they were enemies. The more the doctor tried to seek the prisoner's consent for the operation, the more the prisoner became terrified. Finally, the wise doctor fell back on the only 2 words that he knew in any Indian language: Rabindranath Tagore. Whispering these words 3 times into the prisoner's ears had a transformative effect. The prisoner smiled and gave his consent to the operation, realizing perhaps that his enemy is also his friend. Even as this story might be dismissed as apocryphal, I think it captures the deep internalization of Tagore's name, which evokes reassurance and trust. Neither the doctor nor the prisoner, or for that matter, millions of ordinary people in the world who draw comfort from Tagore's names, are Bengalis or scholars of Bengali literature. Probably their only access to Tagore is through fragments of bad translations, and God knows Tagore contributed towards these translations. But even through these crude words, simplified and distorted, something about Tagore has touched them at a deeply human and spiritual level. It is at this level, I would argue, that affect registers, existing independently of historiography, expertise, or indigenous knowledge. At a more performative level, we could say that affect is that pre-expressive feeling which precedes the moment before emotion gets consolidated through cognition. In a more critical mode, we could say that this internalized affect in the Euro-American world is nothing more than an Orientalist reflex, which compensates for a perceived inadequacy or lack in Euro-American consciousness, a lack that is vicariously fulfilled by the transcendental possibilities which are read or misread through bits and pieces of Tagore's poetry. There is some truth in this argument. But I would also suggest that we need to inflect our post-colonial understanding of Orientalism as articulated by Edward Said. While his magisterial study broke ground in articulating the social, political, and economic effects of Orientalism as a discourse of power, it was less attentive, I believe, to the multiple affects of this discourse at the more personal, intersubjective, ambivalent, and unconscious levels of the Orient's internalization and dissemination. Moreover, given the very precise political geography of Said's Orientalism, which centered around the Middle East in a predominantly East-West binary, I think we need to challenge the assumption that the Orient is exclusively produced in the West for the self-perpetuation of its dominance. Of course, that's true to a large extent. But I would also say that we need to put on the agenda the fact that, quote, we Asians are capable of producing our own Orients in relation to each other. The Euro-American Orient, I would argue, is not merely replicated by us. It is also invented, reinvented, refracted, fantasized, and commodified across different locations. There are overlaps, therefore, between the Orient produced in Europe and the Orients produced in Asia. Said's overdetermined dominance of the Occident over the Orient, as Stefan Tanaka has rightly pointed out, suggests a one-way relationship, which rules out the possibility of the Orient talking back to the Occident in several tongues, or else of incorporating the Occident in a voice of its own, or a multitude of voices. In addition, of course, there is the phenomenon of self-orientalization, which I think cuts across cultures, which can be traced in the ways in which both Tagore and Okakura fashioned themselves as seers of the East. And in this lecture, I'm going to be showing you a lot of rare photographs in which this kind of image of self-orientalization comes true. I'm not even going to try and provide anything like a summary of the great career and vision of one of our most illustrious poets in India. We call him our national poet. He's the composer of our national anthem. He's a composer of Bangladesh's national anthem. I'll just make one remark, and it's pertinent in the context of the lecture I gave yesterday on terror. Tagore is indeed the composer of our national anthem. He's our national poet. but perhaps there is no thinker in the world who has been a more virulent critic of nationalism than Tagore. And that's the paradox that we always have to deal with in Tagore, that how is this man who is our national poet, dearer than anybody else, how could he be so critical of nationalism? And God help us, what would he be thinking about India today? Okay, Okakura is less known to many of you, I'm sure. So let me give you a brief background. Curator, and that's why I'm so happy to be here in Iniva, because this is where he belongs. Curator, art historian, educator, editor, and designer. The leader of the neo-traditionalist art school of the Nihon Bijutsu in Tokyo. This charismatic Japanese traveler called Okakura Kakuzo is said to have introduced the idea of Asia to Tagore when he visited Calcutta, my home city, in 1902. Okakura Kakuzo was his family name, but in 1896, he assumed the pseudonym of Tenshin, which means heart of heaven, a very grandiloquent title, and rather strange for a man who was facing a premature midlife crisis and burnout. And you can be very sure that when people face such disillusionment, India always provides solutions, because that's where you're going to go there. So Okakura is no exception. He came to India and he stayed on in India for 8 months in 1902, socializing with the extended Tagore family and the cultural elite of Bengal, although there is almost no documentation of his actual interactions and conversations with Tagore. And I have to say, this was a blessing for me, because as a non-Bengali to write about Tagore, especially if you're living in Calcutta, you're just waiting for your neck to be chopped, because Bengalis know everything about Tagore. So the thing is that in this particular case, frankly, they didn't know very much, because there's not much there, you know. This left me free to imagine another Asia. Otherwise, it couldn't have happened. So I would say there's no documentation, and perhaps because of this, he has assumed an iconic status, not as a pan-Asian nationalist, which is how I think he needs to be seen, but as an inspirational force of the Bengal school of painting, and most of all, I would say, as a friend whose affective affinities with Tagore continue to be celebrated to this day. Ostensibly, Okakura came to Calcutta to meet Tagore. Oh no, Tagore was relatively unknown in 1902. He was rather young. He came to meet the biggest godman of that time. Who could that be? Swami Vivekananda. And he wanted to invite Swami Vivekananda to attend another quasi-parliament of religions in Japan. However, Vivekananda died in 1902, that very year, which brought Okakura even closer to Sister Nivedita, the very fiery, ardent Irish nationalist who became this Hindu zealot and ardent disciple of Swami Vivekananda. And it was Nivedita who edited Okakura's Pan-Asian tract in English entitled The Ideals of the East. So that's important to keep in mind. She's the editor. By 1904, at the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, Okakura shifted gears in his career and landed up in another part of Asia. Oh no, he went west, and he landed up at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where he built the Japanese and Chinese sections, first as an advisor and then as a curator. So this is the position that Ananda Kumaraswamy later inherited. So this is the legacy. So it was in Boston in February 1913 that he met Rabindranath for the second and the last time in his life. He returned to Japan and died a few months later at the relatively young age of 51. 3 months following his death in 1913, Tagore won the Nobel Prize. And 3 years later, in 1916, Tagore made his first visit to Japan, where he delivered his famous, or more precisely, infamous lectures against nationalism, where Okakura was not alive to provide a response. So this is a very brief sketch of the history covered in this lecture. What is the idea of Asia that brought Tagore and Okakura together? Less a political construction than a metaphysical or spiritual realm of aesthetic ideals, This Asia is clearly, from Tagore's perspective, set in a timeless world of dreams, in a prehistory of, quote, those days when the whole of Eastern Asia, from Burma to Japan, was united with India in the closest tie of friendship, the only natural tie which can exist between nations. There was a living communication of hearts, unquote. This is not the language of a social scientist. It's the language of a poet. Likewise, in Okakura's envisioning of Asia, for all its nationalist and imperialist underpinnings, there is a fundamental indivisibility and unity which comes across in the operatic opening sentence of the Ideals of the East, where Okakura declares with performative intensity, Asia is one. There's some reason to believe that Nivedita might have provided that line. We can't prove it. Perhaps it would have been more accurate for Okakura to acknowledge that Asia is three in one, because his symbolic construction of Asia is triangular, with Japan positioned at the apex of the triangle, synthesizing in some pseudo-Hegelian manner the religion of India and the communitarian traditions of China, which Okakura quaintly designated as communism. True to his curatorial persona, Okakura sees Japan represented by the continuum of its rich artistic heritage. So Japan gets identified with art. An artistic heritage which compels him to compare Japan to a museum of Asiatic civilization. And to my mind, this is the first reference I'm aware of where a nation is specifically compared to a museum. Japan is also the mediator and ultimate protector of the rest of Asia because alone among Asian nations, it remains uncolonized. Needless to say, with such hierarchical assumptions, Okakura plays into the paradox that Japan is and is not a part of Asia, a conundrum that persists among Japanese nationalist thinkers to this day. Now, bouncing off this idea of Asia, let me try to inflect it through the methodology of performance, which is what interests me. I use the word performance in a number of ways. First, in the sense of an embodied act, held together by the minutiae of voice, gesture, script, costume, and appearance, which are specifically combined, constructed, and performed for the gratification of a specific audience. So, a rather conventional theatrical understanding of performance. Performance can also have a wider social register. You can be talking about performances of everyday life. You can be talking about performance in terms of social behavior. You can be talking about performance into the way institutions interact with each other. That's another way of dealing with performance. I will also engage more sparingly with the rhetorical and discursive constituents underlying the concept of performativity, where, drawing on J.L. Austin's linguistic assumptions, performatives, a noun, are not just descriptions or informational reports, but actions, events, and doings. So performatives are doings. Something is done through a performative. In the more exacting interpretation provided by Judith Butler, performative acts are forms of authoritative speech. They are, quote, statements which in the uttering also perform a certain action and exercise a binding power. So if I say, stand up, sit down, or if you take a gentler example, the marriage vow, the famous marriage vow, I do, that those simple words, I do, in those words, of course, the marriage act is sealed. Later in this talk, I will indicate the limits of applying this theory to the lectures and writings of Tagore and Okakura, which can never be entirely freed from the histrionic agency of their performances. In contrast, Butler would go to the extent of emphasizing that performativity, unlike embodied performances, consists in, quote, a reiteration of norms which precede, constrain, and exceed the performer and in that sense cannot be taken as the fabrication of the performer's will or choice. I would say that this premise is very hard to sustain within the personality-driven discourses of Tagore and Okakura, who spoke out of a very strong will and choice indeed, and who worked against norms in plain-speaking and occasionally flamboyant ways. So what I'll try to demonstrate in this lecture is the interplay of performance and performativity, which play on each other's conventions and are more symbiotically linked than is acknowledged in Butler's overt discursivity. Okay, so let's just begin with the theatrical understanding of performance, and I'm going to focus here on the most important thing, and that's appearance and presence. So how did Tagore and Okakura present themselves to the world, and more specifically, how did they embody Asia in the way they dressed and posed for the camera? So could we have the first image? And the lights down, please. Okay, so in this image we see Okakura in a somewhat whimsical painting by one of his disciples, Kanzan Shimomura, with his drooping mustache, tau cap, cigarette in one hand and a stylus in the other. This image brings to mind Okakura's riveting presence as evoked by Surendranath Tagore. Surendranath Tagore was the nephew of Rabindranath. In his memoir, Surendranath describes meeting Okakura for the first time at a party held at the American consulate in Calcutta. Quote, Okakura sat at ease with a profound gravity of expression, incessantly smoking Egyptian cigarettes. Surendranath was appropriately knocked out by the kimono-clad Okakura, who offered him a cigarette, apparently, and it's not just offering him a cigarette. It seems that Okakura produced a tin of cigarettes from under the sleeve of his kimono. And then after doing this Houdini kind of magic act, he then says, what are you thinking of doing for your country? Okakura demands of the diffident Surendranath in a pre-Swadeshi context. Okakura then begins to play the role of the revolutionary who tries to impress Surendranath with a bogus samurai story in which he describes, quote, the headless trunk of his uncle still in a sitting posture, the arteries of his neck spurting fountains of blood. Clearly, if Okakura can get away with such a lurid story rendered with carefully calculated histrionics, for God's sake, he's a performer. Okay, image 2. Next image, please. Now, this is a publicity photograph of Okakura for his second book, The Awakening of Japan, which was published in Boston in 1904, also in English. From 1902 onwards, Okakura wrote primarily in English. Okakura always wore Japanese dress, most assertively in his social interactions with Boston Brahmins. He had one priceless suggestion for his son, quote, never wear Japanese costume if you speak broken English. Now, this performative, which was quite literally put into practice by Okakura, raises a number of questions. Does one risk orientalizing oneself only if one has the capacity to talk back? What does it mean to retain one's foreignness in order to assert not nativism, but a larger sense of belonging to the world? And at what point does this vernacular cosmopolitanism become a trap? Image 3. This is an early image of Okakura seated on horseback wearing the uniform of the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, where he was a principal in 1891. That's a very young age, and Japan, authority, hierarchy, so for a young man to get that role, there was something special about him. All the teachers and students of the school wore the same uniform, a dress code that rejected the westernization of the Meiji period for a more ceremonial garb from the Nara period, which extends from 710 to 784 AD. Now, this is really strange. We could say, yeah, I don't want to be suited and booted in this Meiji fashion, but to go back 12 centuries in time and say, I want to dress like that, Now that's, I mean, authentication with a vengeance. So traditional Japaneseness had to be authenticated even at home. Image 4. And here we see Okakura and his avatar as a fisherman, replete with a fishing rod, basket, what looks like a Siberian fur cape, and a Tao cap. Clearly a costume of a fisherman and not a naturalistic representation of a real Japanese fisherman. Okakura stares directly into the camera, daring us to question his performative pose as he goes native. So if he wants to go native, he will, but on his terms and in a very hybrid and quirky way. Image 5. This is a very, I think, special image. This is a melancholic portrait of Okakura in Boston, dressed in his haori and kimono. The pouches under his eyes and generally sad demeanor reveal the Oriental in exile. Quote, "Boston is sad and dreary, as Okakura mentions in one of his letters. I have few friends. I make a brave attempt and go to dinner parties and come back bored and miserable. With best intentions, my well-wishers expect me to entertain them. Who am I, a weary spirit, to bring them laughter? The Japanese artist entertaining the Boston Brahmins, big, rich people like Isabella Gardner, entertaining them with his exoticism, well, Okakura is clearly tired of this performance. One can understand why he acknowledged feeling a sudden loneliness when Rabindranath left Boston in February 1913, the last time they met. Now, keeping in mind the motifs of costume, aura, and photographic pose, let us now turn to Tagore to capture how his affect is produced. And I'm going to begin just by showing you 3 very rare images of Tagore from his first trip to Japan. And I won't talk very much about it. I'll just let the images speak. And the images are by K. Mekawa. Image. Clearly the writer. Next. Next. The cup of tea is a prop, I would say. We're always asked in the theater, when you're drinking anything in the theater, it's an old cliche, were you really drinking tea? You know, that cup of tea is probably empty. And that's one thing, it's there for angle, for light, and for all those things, the reflection on the table. But the other thing at a semiotic level, if you wanted to go into the image, it's an English cup of tea. It's not Japanese. And so Okakura always had this very hybrid taste for sampling and engaging with other cultures, very like Tagore in this regard. Next image. Here we see the poet in perfect profile, almost Romanesque in appearance, with aquiline nose and perfectly trimmed beard. Tagore almost always posed for photographs. He hated being caught off guard. At one level, his portraits play into the image of the world poet, Bisho Kobi, for which he has been taken to task for catering to the West. The writer Omid Chowdhury, for instance, regards this image as, quote, a harmful falsification, symptomatic of a time when Western humanism presumed the translatability of all cultures into one another's terms and the existence of a generalized human sensibility. In short, it required the Tagore it invented. I don't quite agree with this view. This view, I would argue, does not engage with the possibility, the reality actually, that the poet had his own views on universal humanism, which did not simply endorse dominant Western assumptions of humanity. So while he was drawn to the spirit of the West, he despised the nation of the West. Tagore's universals are also highly particularized and grounded in the nuances and experiential depths of Bengali language and culture. And as you may read in my book, Tagore did not always feel that these nuances could be translated. And this was one of the reasons why he had a rather edgy relationship with Victoria Ocampo, one of his great benefactors. And when you say, I'm sorry, I can't translate that for you, you wouldn't understand it. I don't think that's particularly universal, you know. There's something else going on there. Moreover, I think it would be somewhat reductive to see Tagore's performative appearance as a mere capitulation to an Orientalist image of the East manufactured in the West. I think that's too simple. Tagore's choice of attire, I'd like to believe, came out of a deeply personal, critical introspection in response to the politics of culture at home. One could say that he choreographed his appearance, not only for the Western audience, but for his own sense of personhood and the dignity, self-respect, and grace attached to it. His attire was his own invention. There were many talented people in his family who experimented with fashion and design, but how he dressed is how he wanted to appear. And I would say it's a highly subjective and reflexive sartorial signature through which he could distinguish himself and yet feel at ease. Next image. Now, it's captured in this photograph taken in a studio in Vienna, Austria in 1926, and I sometimes wonder, what is it that made Tagore go to a studio while he was traveling? What was the occasion? Well, this image radiates an aura that is almost more Persian than Bengali, as he appears in his fez-like cap and Sufi robe. Rejecting the nativism of Swadeshi politics and the artificiality of Indo-European clothing, Tagore arrived at, as Emma Tarlow points out in her good book, Clothing Matters, he arrived at a more complex form of hybridizing a Hindu-Muslim sartorial style through his use of a loose robe worn over the jubba, the inner tunic. Significantly, Tagore never wore a dhoti for his lectures abroad, that cloth that you wrap around yourself, which I think would have been, he considered too impractical. The dhoti is also associated with the fervor of the Swadeshi days, which he had left behind. In this sense, I would argue he was the total antithesis of Gandhi, who performed his indigenous politics through a highly subversive costuming, or more precisely, a disrobing of himself as, quote, a naked fakir, clad in loincloth and the roughest of khadi shawls. I think Gandhi's sartorial sense and his politics of dress was something audacious. One could even risk saying queer, but there was a defiance there. There was a kind of radicality in the way I will appear naked like this. You'll see my chest. I'm going to go right up there and I'm going to talk to all the biggest people in the world. In contrast, next please. Here we see Tagore in his archetypal image as Gurudev on his 75th birthday, celebrated in Shantiniketan in 1936. I would say there are two possible readings of the closeted structure of Tagore's clothing, which completely encloses his body. I've seen hundreds of photographs of Tagore. And I have to say, if you're looking for flesh, you're not going to find it. You know, I'm talking of flesh here. I'm talking of this. I'm talking of this. It's very, very hard to find that. It's very enclosed. The image of a bare-chested Tagore, or let's say a nude Tagore, since we are in the art world, I think this continues to be irreverent to this date, playing into the regulatory codes of Bhadralok propriety. Respectability has to prevail and protect any possible distortion of Bengal's most sacrosanct icon. And really, it's very sad to say this, and very painful to say this, but the only time I feel that Tagore's body was really exposed was when he died. And his dead body was paraded through the streets of Calcutta, and there were hordes there. They were just wanting to claw that body. And it's like a complete contrast to the way he protected his body in some ways, It's very sad. Okay, so Tagore's performativity of Asia was perhaps most marked in his lectures abroad. These were highly publicized celebrity events for which he charged $700 per lecture. This is 1916. And he gave maybe 40 lectures on a tour. And he had a very high price. He commanded a huge price in the immediate aftermath of winning the Nobel Prize. The price somewhat fell later. And of course, there were cynics who said, my God, we're paying him $700 and all he's doing is scolding us, you know. So $700 for a scold is too much. But just to give you an idea, this is a side of Tagore that we don't know of in Bengal. We don't deal with this in Bengal. There are other more important things to deal with. But this is a side of Tagore, and I want to showcase it here. Next image. Look at this. This is one such glittering event, a reception for around 2,000 members of the New History Society at the Grand Ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York City on December 7th, 1930. Where is Tagore in this image? Where is he? Right there. He's seated right at the back. The poor man is almost stone. He almost wants to disappear, you feel. He's barely visible, while of course the audience, what is the audience doing? They're turning their heads away from him in the direction of the camera, you know, to record themselves as witnesses in a once-in-a-lifetime experience, you know. Page 3 with a vengeance, you know. Image 13. Now, this is a rare image. In this newspaper image, we see Tagore delivering a lecture at the university in Berlin, which is now known as the Humboldt University, in June 1921. And he's addressing a packed audience of almost, I believe, 15,000 ardent listeners. It's huge. If you had to do close-ups of these images, my God, people are just, you know, sardined here. It is said that there was almost a stampede as girl students were trampled on in the rush to hear Tagore. The police had to intervene, and a second lecture by Tagore had to be organized the following day. Clearly, we're dealing with a superstar celebrity here, whose message on the religion of the forest and the soul of India spoke deeply to an audience which was in the process of recovering from Germany's defeat in the First World War. Now, in Japan, everything misfired, as I'll tell you later on, because he had the audacity to critique and condemn nationalism in the midst of the First World War to Japanese. He said, your nationalism will kill you. You're committing suicide when you follow this kind of religion. But in Germany, not a word on the war or on the nationalism of a defeated nation. He chose to dwell on romantic idealism, poetry, ecology, nature, cosmos, and spirituality, and the Germans just lapped it up. Now, while his audience was mesmerized by his presence, there were criticisms made by leading writers like Rilke and Stefan Zweig of his oriental lethargy, bloodlessness, Indian mildness, as opposed to robust, action-oriented German dynamism. The unkindest cut of all came from Thomas Mann, who, after attending a post-lecture party in Munich hosted by Tagore's publisher, Kurt Wolff, whose 8-volume collected works of Tagore coincided with the lecture tour in 1921, noted in his diary. This is Thomas Mann. Quote, select gathering. The impression of Tagore of a fine old English lady gained strength. His son was brown and muscular, a masculine type. Very odd sexual politics at work here. On a sour note, Mann ends by saying, quote, Tagore did not seem to grasp who I was. So it's like, you know, it's not just actors who are divas. I mean, sometimes writers are the biggest divas of our times. Now, at a performative level, try and look at the image. We have evidence here of what would be called the lecture machine, that specific apparatus of intellectual production where a solitary speaker addresses a packed audience, looming over the pulpit-like lectern with all the accessories of manuscript, flowers, university crest, and the vacant chair behind the speaker. There's a perceptible excitement in the intensity of the audience response. And if in this image, Tagore stands regally, I mean, look at that back, holding his manuscript in hand. Next image. very difficult image to read, but in this image, he's shown gesturing quite forcefully in one direction of the audience as his speech act is caught mid-gesture. And I would say it's a very rare image for the poet, who's generally shown perfectly composed and still. So basically there are three images, hands there, hands here, hands here. Nothing else. You'll never see Tagore doing what I'm doing here, you know, using your hands. No animation of hand gesture. Next image. Very old image. In this image from 1916, we experience a very different ambience from the packed lecture hall in Berlin. Here we see Tagore sitting cross-legged, Buddha-like, as you can see under the tree, in the sylvan surroundings of the summer campus of the Japan Women's University. For me, it's a scene straight out of a proscenium play, with the poet flanked symmetrically by dignitaries sitting on chairs, while the chorus of women students are shown with their backs and hairdos almost replicating each other, a phalanx of clone-like bodies. It is said that the poet treated the students to a recitation of his poems in the green and calm garden, almost Shantiniketan in aura. Next image. Okay, and here we have a prototype of the modern lecture, considerably more modest than the Berlin Spectacular. Tagore is addressing the Indo-Japanese Association on May 19, 1929 in Tokyo. And I'd like you to remember this particular image. I'm going to come back to it at the end of my talk. He seems to be speaking without notes, even though the interpreter is dutifully present, pad in hand. And from past experience, I can tell you that the Japanese interpreters are very tough and they're very hard to negotiate. They take their job very, very seriously. Now, this forum is particularly important because it is here that Tagore's tribute to Okakura is most fully expressed. And I find this strange. Why didn't he talk about Okakura when he went to Japan in 1916? Okakura was dead for just 3 years. Why doesn't he talk about him then? Why does he choose to talk about Okakura in 1930? So here, what does he say? Not only is Okakura invoked as the voice of the East, Tagore goes on to say that, quote, "This meeting had the effect of drawing the heart of our people in Bengal towards your country more than any other fact that has happened since then or before that time. It was that personal relationship, personal influence in which he represented the best of Japan." Highlighting the personal as opposed to the political, Tagore then proceeds to use the rhetoric of cultural diplomacy. Quote, "If this association of culture and sympathy is allowed to grow, then someday will be developed not merely national culture, national minds, but a continental mind of Asia, greatly needed and long waiting to be revealed." I find this interesting because he's talking of a continental mind of Asia. It's no longer that one Asia, metaphysical kind of Asia. And he's acknowledging it is waiting to be revealed. It's not yet there. So that Asia is in the making. Okay. Now, it was not just Tagore's appearance that made him almost an object of darshan for his spectators. It was his voice. And what I'm going to play for you now is a really rare recording of a 1921 recording of Tagore's voice. So it's a very scratchy recording. You may not be able to hear everything, but wait for the end of this bite. And it was not done during his lecture because in 1921, apparently, microphones were not used in lectures. So it was a special recording of the last part of his lecture. So could we hear that, please?
India holds sacred and counts as places of pilgrimage all spots which display a special beauty of splendor of nature. The Himalayas of India are sacred, and the Vindhya hills, our majestic rivers, are sacred. Lake Manasa and the confluence of the Ganges and the Yamuna are sacred. India has saturated with her voice and worship the great nature with which her children are surrounded, whose light fills their eyes with gladness, and whose water cleanses them, whose food gives them light, and from whose majestic mystery come forth constant declaration of the infinite in music, scent, and color, bringing awakening to their souls. India gains the world through worship, through communion of souls. The idea of freedom to which India aspired was based upon realization of spiritual unity. It is India's duty to be loyal to this great truth and never allow it to be extinguished by the storm of passion sweeping over the present-day world. That is why we must be careful today to try to find out the principles by means of which India will be able for certain to realize herself. That principle is neither commercialism nor nationalism. It is not merely self-determination, but self-conquest and self-dedication. The voice of this truth was heard in India's forests of old, above the din of race conflict. It was declared in the Upanishad and expounded in the Gita. Lord Buddha renounced the world that he might make this truth the household word for all mankind. Kabir, Nanak, and other great spirits of India continued to proclaim its message. India's grand achievement, which is still stored deep within her heart, is waiting to unite within itself Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, and Christian, not by force, not by the apathy of resignation, but in the harmony of active cooperation. Ananda Devaka Vimani Bhuta Nijayante Anandena Jata Nijivanti Anandam Kamprayan Yadhisam Visham.
Thank you. Could we switch this off? Now, the voice is pitched, thrown out, never pausing for breath, as it almost never ceases to flow in a surge of energy, the high pitch taking on a different sonority, as the voice breaks the protocols of the spoken word with an unabashed submission to song and chant. And for me, that's what is so moving about this recording, is the way the voice just moves into this chant mode. You know, it just goes, and it's so, I mean, it's a professional recording, you know. So he's probably been told, Mr. Tagore, you have 3.5 minutes for this. He probably nods. He's seated over there and he's delivering. You know what I mean? It's just on the mark. He's not making a false note there. I would say it's a totally uninhibited performance of the voice, which is distinctive in its audacious refusal to submit to the verisimilitude of the academic lecture. Could we have full lights? So, let me now turn to the politics of performativity as rendered in the rhetoric of Tagore and Okakura. I'll begin by examining some excerpts from a somewhat xenophobic tract written by Okakura in 1902, in all probability co-authored with Sister Nivedita, which he had wanted to entitle We Are One. We Are Not One could have been a more appropriate title, because it is likely that this text was partially responsible for his falling out with Nivedita over the critical issue of the ownership of Asia. Now, when I entered this terrain, I'm not a Tagore scholar, but why did I write about Asia? I wrote about Asia. There was a political impulse, as exists in most of my writing. And basically, I was quite angered by the fact that there are certain countries like Singapore, Malaysia, who have invested in Asia as property, as intellectual property. And there's a certain kind of investment and copyright that goes with that property. And countries like India, even today, are supposed to, in a sense, provide the materials and the inspiration and the sources for this property. So I had that kind of political impulse, and I wanted to say, how else can we think of Asia today? So this idea of ownership of Asia actually goes back a very long time. It's not just happening now. So eventually this text, We Are One, it was not published in his lifetime. It was published in 1938. That's 36 years later, as the awakening of the East, playing into the ultra-nationalist ethos of Japan in the Second World War, where Okakura was resurrected as a nationalist icon. So keeping in mind the paradox that Japan is and is not a part of Asia, let us read how Okakura positions himself in relation to India. Quote, I see before me today an orphan child of Asia seeking in vain that parental care which she has lost forever. The Himalayas bow their heads down to the plains in this mute agony. So this apparent compassion for us is then followed by derision. Quote, wolves are made to devour, sheep can but bleat. We have still the shadow of grandeur. They have only a memory of mutiny. Now, this is really a come down. This is very, very cutting. So in contrast to this barely concealed condescension for a colonized no nation, and I use this word no nation, this comes from Tagore. It's his neologism. And of course, when Tagore says we are a no nation, he says it with pride, you know. He's claiming we are a no nation, you know. Of course, for Okakura, this is like, what are you? You're not a nation, you know. Okakura, in contrast to this condescension, displays his Asian affinities more boldly in relation to his critique of Orientalism as an academic discipline. Now, Orientalism as a discipline existed in India by the 1780s through the Asiatic Society with the translation of Shakuntala, etc. Orientalism in Japan was instituted as late as 1905. But of course, Okakura was fully aware of what was being published about Asia. He was extremely savvy. So in a pseudo-Saidian register, albeit in a flippant and populist mode, Okakura says, quote, Sanskrit is barbarous if not Germanic. The Taj is a blot if not Italian. Shakuntala is a wonder because Goethe admired it. Vedantism is a treasure trove because Schopenhauer borrowed from it. Now, these are very bitchy bites, you could say. There's nothing else here. But under these bites are actually saying something pretty important. And what he's doing here, he's attacking the phenomenon of non-Western knowledge being authenticated in Europe through self-serving endorsements. And he said, fuck you. He wouldn't have said that. You will not authenticate us. We will authenticate you. You know, don't you presume to authenticate us. So the post-colonial or whatever you want to call it is already there, you know. Questioning the politics of expertise, he asks, quote, who in Oxford or Heidelberg can compete with a second-rate Shastri in his knowledge of Brahmanical law? It's very, very grand. Now, this critique of Orientalism is then followed by a more ambivalent wallowing in the rhetoric of archaic Orientalia. It's an amazing passage here. Quote, come, trot out the merry bowl, my favorite hookah, my opium pipe of jade. Let the sleek sannyasi feast in his cozy cell. Let the jolly fakir carol under his shady tree. Let the maundering mandarin write his bad poetry as much as ever. The world is for the survival of the fittest. Why should we interfere? I think it's an amazing passage to read because it has so many different registers. So I would say this histrionic outburst can be read ironically, almost self-mockingly, as if Okakura is deriding the passivity and waste of time in the Orient, lost in its sloth and dreams. How can Orientalism not exist in the context of such a real Orient which is unable to contend with the contemporary logic of the survival of the fittest? So there are many different kinds of registers here. And yet, along with this mockery, self-mockery, there are also moments when Okakura returns to the fundamental cultural affinities by which he says, the Oriental is at home, at one with the Oriental. So for all the cosmopolitanism of travel and talking back to the West in an orientalized persona, Okakura would seem to acknowledge that ultimately one can be true to self only in the Orient. In contrast to the overtly histrionic tenor of Okakura's rhetoric and shifting voices, the performativity of Tagore's lectures is cast in more complex political registers. So while denouncing nationalism in Japan in his 1916 lecture delivered in the midst of the First World War, and condemning, however tacitly, Japan's colonization of Korea, he ultimately lands up positioning Japan as the savior of the East. Quote, I'm going to focus on one sentence. In your voice, Asia shall answer the questions that Europe has submitted to the conference of man. Quite an amazing statement. He's using the metaphor of the conference in a conference. He's saying in your voice, in his voice. In addition, of course, one could argue that there's an abdication of voice in this statement at two levels. Not only does Tagore assume Japan's right, if not responsibility, to represent voice Asia, he also accepts that the questions to which Japan will respond have already been submitted by Europe to the Conference of Man. So where does that leave India? It would seem that defeated nations like India have no voice whatsoever, except in lectures, where their presumption to berate the developed world risks being duly mocked. And that's what happened. From your voice, the land of the rising sun is formally told to, quote, remember that she has the mission of the East to fulfill. She must infuse the sap of a fuller humanity into the heart of modern civilization. So peremptory in its impulse, the mission has all the ardor of a redemptionist Orientalist project in which Japan is exhorted to save modern civilization with humanity. And yet, in the same lecture, Tagore has roundly condemned Japan for its submission to the mechanization of modernity. So there's a very complex series of things going on here. Tagore himself is a modernist. Clearly in his aesthetic, he's a modernist. He believes in modernism, but a modernism without modernization, you might argue. And what is modernism? It is being true to self. So these are very, in a sense, personally interpreted and complex registers. Now, unavoidably, these contradictions, complexities, provoked a sense of bewilderment among his Japanese hosts, who were compelled to acknowledge that their celebrated son of the East, the first Nobel Prize from Asia, was something of a defeatist, a victim of resignationism, a mere, quote, beautiful flower of a ruined country. And yet, I would argue that one has to read Tagore's rhetoric more closely to realize that what appears to be deferential and defeatist is actually steeped in assumptions of self-possession, if not political audacity. Thus, he ends the lecture on nationalism in India, which I think was a publication, which is included in his volume on nationalism, and he ends the lecture by affirming another amazing statement: we should actively try to adapt the world powers to guide our history to its own perfect end. So, can you imagine any of us saying today, we have to adapt the world powers, you know? We should actively try to adapt them, you know, not follow them, you know. Tagore's not rejecting the world powers of what would be called globalization today. He's actively seeking to adapt them, not merely to reform them in a moralistic mode, but to ensure, and here's the twist, so that they can, quote, guide our history to its own perfect end. So the singularity of our history, as opposed to world history, is what Ronajit Guho has so finely theorized as history at the limit of world history. It's a poet's history. It's a history that deals with the facticity of being and not the factuality of historiography. It's a history that believes in the history of that day, where a poet's perception can see things that historians would never get to see. Sadly, of course, this history is not regarded as history in an academic kind of frame, and it's mocked and silenced even today. So the important thing to keep in mind is that Tagore's performativity was out of sync with the context in which he delivered his lectures, and therefore his words could not become actions as the theory of performativity assumes, which is what I had addressed earlier. Tagore's rhetoric was far too yoked to his will and desire to envision a new world, and was totally devoid of any strategy in engaging with the already existing political discourse, of which he seemed to know very little. It's not surprising, therefore, that his lectures in Japan failed resoundingly. If there were more than 20,000 spectators waiting to greet him at Tokyo Station at the start of his lecture tour, that's a modest estimate, 20,000, he was persona non grata by the end of the tour. So when he left Japan and he went to America for another round of lectures and he came back to Japan, no one waiting for him. No one. He was cut dead. In China in 1924, the reception was even more hostile, with the most effective performative being unleashed by the Communist Youth League and other radicals in the audience in the form of an abuse. Go back, slave, from a lost country. And this was a really effective performative because Tagore had no other choice but to cut his lecture tour short, at once disillusioned and humiliated. And I do believe, since we're in an art world and many people talk about inter-Asian collaborations and so on and so forth, there's so much to open up in this early history. We haven't even begun to fully acknowledge this history. You know, we just try and deal with diplomatic niceties at some level, or some weird art installations of which make no sense apart from a few artists doing them. But the political history here is so charged and it's so moving. Okay. To shift the tone of this lecture from the conflictual dynamics of inter-Asian political tensions to the affective affinities evoked by friendship and love, let me introduce another figure in this narrative, Priyambada Devi Banerjee. Next image. This beautiful, elegant woman is a poet whom Okakura had met over a cup of tea during a fleeting visit to Calcutta in 1912, when Rabindranath was not around. Priyambada and Okakura were drawn to each other and continued to share love letters for a year, until almost the last day of his life. In this portrait, she looks longingly towards her distant lover, whom she never sees again. What appears to be a portrait of Bhodra Mohila respectability is actually quite a radical act, because Priyambada is a widow. For her to go to a studio and pose for Okakura was stretching the norms of her gentrified world. And God knows this was a petty world, because their letters were intercepted. When Okakura finally received Priyambada's photograph in the post, for which he had hankered, I would imagine, like any avid surfer on a dating network, though of course today on a dating network it's the photograph that precedes the correspondence, not the other way around, he is satisfied. What does he say? It is a saintly presence indeed. To this arguably Orientalist response, Priyambada asks, what made you think of me like that? Are you never afraid that I may be a mirage, a chimera, a will-o'-the-wisp, an illusion only? I may be all these, yet who knows? I may be a reality too. Please do not think of me as an impossible perfection. I'm nothing of the kind. I'm only a woman, a human being, and that, I think, is dignity enough. Don't you agree with me? I think it's an amazing correspondence. this kind of civility and this kind of, clarity and, speaking your mind kind of thing. So who's speaking here? Priyambada, of course, it's her voice. Where's the language coming from? If Japan is being urged by Tagore to voice the rest of Asia, I would suggest that Tagore is speaking through Priyambada here at a discursive, unconscious level. She has not merely internalized his language of love, like many other Bengalis from her class in its myriad registers. She is perhaps able to think and articulate the state of being in love on account of his own contribution to the Bengali imaginary of modern love in the age of Swadeshi. Priyambada perhaps is another Chitranguda, affirming her reality against the illusions of impossible beauty. Along with love for Priyambada, one needs to mention the close friendship that Okakura shared with Surendranath Tagore. Next image, please. This is a relationship which embodies what Eve Sedgwick has so finely nuanced as homosocial intimacy. In this case, a cross-cultural intimacy of two men, Bengali and Japanese, who create their own grounds of friendship through travel and fun. Both of them wander in rural Bihar in search of Nalanda, which is never found. Okakura gets Surendranath to disguise himself as a Japanese in a kimono so that they can smuggle extra bottles of sake from a Japanese ocean liner in Mumbai. And both of them enjoy seeing passengers flee from their train compartment, unable to tolerate the stench of Bombay duck, which Okakura relished. Now, I would say the very trivia of their activities is what contributes to the affective affinities of their friendship. And let me tell you that one of the hardest things to theorize in cultural theory is fun. I think one of the biggest problems is that, we are all so burdened in the academic world with the profound issues of life that you don't realize that sometimes getting a kick out of somebody or finding laughter in something is one of the most beautiful things that can bring people together, but we don't theorize that. In the final meeting, which is rendered by Surendranath in an almost cinematic manner, both men are waiting for Okakura's train to depart. Neither of them can eat. Surendranath asks, "Are you not feeling well?" Okakura looks up with a mournful smile. "Can't you understand?" is all he says. Okakura leaves parting presents for Surendranath's family, exemplifying the primacy of the gift in celebrating any friendship. Not a coercive, calculative, and strategic gift in the tradition of Marcel Mauss, for which there is an inbuilt expectation that the gift will have to be returned, but rather a gift of the heart in a more Derridian sense, which, far from being restricted to any bond or bind, is purely gratuitous, non-reciprocal, and atemporal. Surendranath ends his memoir by invoking his entire family, who, quote, "can never think of Okakura as lost to us. He has been totally embraced." And no amount of critical deconstruction of Okakura's dubious career and politics, I would argue, can dispel the fact that he remains a friend forever. To complicate this somewhat too romantic rendering of affect, let me insert into the argument the possibility that in certain historical contexts, the power of politics can disrupt the most deeply entrenched affinities. This was the case with Tagore and Noguchi Yonejiro, a Japanese poet writing in English. Could we have the next slide? Who had been one of Tagore's very few supporters during his disastrous lecture tour in 1916. What brought them together was not Asia, but an affinity for English romantic poetry. It was Keats that brought them together. And yet, many, many years later, with the advent of the Second World War and Japan's invasion of China and the Nanjing Massacre, Tagore was compelled to critique Japan's ruthless imperialism, even as he was aware that as an admirer of Japan, he had lost face in the eyes of the world. In a bitter correspondence initiated by Noguchi in 1938, and this next one, please. And this is what he looked like. Some things change. Is it just age? Noguchi defended the invasion of China by saying that it was, quote, the inevitable means, terrible it is though, for establishing a great world in the Asiatic continent, where the principle of live and let live has to be realized. He went on to describe this diabolical principle as the war of Asia for Asia. This is a deadly tautology. Now Japan is totally identified with Asia, both as an agent of ultimate deliverance and as the realized utopia of the great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Tagore responds to Noguchi's militarism sharply, quote, you are building your conception of an Asia which would be raised on a tower of skulls. The doctrine of Asia for Asia, which you enunciate as an instrument of political blackmail, has all the virtues of the lesser Europe, which I repudiate, and nothing of the larger humanity that makes us one across the barriers of political labels and divisions. So even as a ground of one Asia can no longer be sustained, it is significant that Tagore continues to uphold the idea of one, but in the larger context of a highly particularized and inflected universal humanism. At some point in the correspondence, Tagore invokes Okakura as the big-hearted Japanese thinker who had been among the first to remind him that China is great. Now, of course, we have to gloss that statement by saying that Okakura was referring to China's greatness in relation to the art treasures of China. But what he was not sharing with Tagore is that he was a middleman. He was peddling those very art treasures of China and selling them to Boston, where many of those art treasures are still to be found. So his role in all of this was pretty dodgy and shady, but Tagore didn't know any of this. He just knew the art treasures. So this is perhaps the last reference to Okakura and Tagore's oeuvre, and it is moving how his memory continues to haunt Tagore years after his death with a posthumous intensity. Noguchi rejects Tagore's assumptions of China's, quote, inherently superior moral stature by saying, quote, I am glad that you still admire Kakuzo Okakura with enthusiasm as a thinker. If he lives today, I believe that he will say the same thing as I do. Could we have the lights off? So, switch it off, please, and full lights. So, one is left at this point with a question whether Okakura indeed would have affirmed the nationalism thrust on him by a growing caucus of ultra-nationalist thinkers. I prefer to believe that his cosmopolitanism would have tempered his nationalism, though it's hard to fully predict the outcome of his disillusioned globalization. Even more questionable is the endurance of the friendship between Tagore and Okakura, though my own affinities to their mutually imbricated biographies compel me to quote the French philosopher Montaigne, who provides the monograph for my book on Another Asia, quote, if you press me to tell why I loved him, I feel this cannot be expressed except by answering because it was he, because it was I. The affective affinities in this construction are based on a reciprocity of singularities. There is no larger community that is being invoked here, either in terms of family or clan or nation or the cosmopolis. So even when Surendranath Tagore is embracing Okakura, ultimately he invokes the family. The family embraces Tagore, not here. In today's world, affinities tend to operate through networks which span geographical and cultural distances. Admittedly, these networks existed in the time of Tagore and Okakura as well, through coteries of Boston Brahmins and the spiritual seekers of Swami Vivekananda, whose paths occasionally crossed. Today's networks are more virtual and span more differentiated terrains and temporalities, rhizomatic and ephemeral. They often play into illusions of intimacy, even while celebrating the expediency of short-term alliances and fluid partnerships. When affective affinities do get consolidated into communities in ashrams and alternative societies, as evoked by Leela Gandhi in her splendid book on anti-colonial visionaries, experimenters, and eccentrics, I think these communities risk becoming sectarian. Once institutionalized, the utopianism of affinities frequently gets crushed by the rules and regulations of alternatives, or else the ideals of the emergent tend to be constrained and censored by the unacknowledged insularity and pieties of affective communities. These communities, I would argue, tend to revolve around themselves, preaching to the converted and seething with subterranean nationalisms from within. I would prefer to see the affective affinities of Tagore and Okakura, therefore, in a more peripheral context, in a Fosterian context, if you will, and not in terms of a larger anti-colonial movement. In this regard, I find myself turning once again to the conclusion of my book, for which I have not yet found an alternative. Invoking Okakura at the Indo-Japanese Association in 1929 in Tokyo, remember that image that I showed you earlier, that modern lecture image, that moment, Tagore provides this insight, quote, Okakura would often buy some very cheap things, like simple clay oil pots that peasants use, with ecstasy of admiration. Some things in which we had failed to realize the instinct for beauty. I think it is this instinct for beauty and not the larger principle of beauty or larger philosophy of beauty. It's just this instinct for beauty that provides the fundamental ground for the affective affinities of Tagore and Okakura. And while we need to be aware that beauty in its more discursive manifestations can be another kind of aesthetic warfare, as Okakura once put it, and that it can camouflage repression and all kinds of censorship and even violence, it can also be a source of pleasure. Tagore's description of Okakura buying clay pots is perhaps the only corporeal, interactive image that we have in the entire documentation of their lives. There are two things that strike me as being important about this image. First of all, it inflects the codes of hospitality insofar as it is the guest who is pointing out to the host what is so special in his culture. And second, far from admiring national treasures like the Ajanta frescoes or the Sanchi stupa or the image of the Buddha in Bodh Gaya, what brings Tagore and Okakura together is a clay oil pot, the very quintessence of ordinariness. It is not likely that a new sociality, still less a new history outside the purview of world history, can be readily built on the illumination of such a moment, but perhaps what we can do is to imagine its possibilities and arrive at another epistemic framework of knowledge and creativity, which can challenge the existing hegemonic, orientalist, nationalist, and global associations of Asia in our times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rustom, for a wonderful lecture and for sharing this extraordinary material with us.
we have time for questions now. I just want to start with one question, and that is to just bring up again the term that you mentioned in the lecture, which was one that fascinated us, in fact, in our conversations in Shantiniketan, which was this idea of no nation, and that Tagore would hold up this idea of no nation against nationalism. But in a sense, of course, it's a very open term, and I wondered if you could say a few words about some of the things that Tagore might have filled that term with.
Well, that's the core, isn't it? In my book, I have a whole chapter on nationalism, and that's a different register there. I don't think we've really come to grips with epistemologies of the national. You know, we tend to subsume the national in nationalism. It's almost inevitable that we do that. You know, we can't see it as offering any kind of counter. You know, and so it gets absorbed in nationalism. And nationalism, frankly, there's not much that one can say that's, you know, very positive about nationalism in the way it's being played out in today's world. For God's sake, it's violent, it's divisive, it's racist very often. It is built on notions of cultural superiority, exclusionism. You know, all of that he was able to see. I mean, when I read Tagore, and because my background is in literature, so I think I have a sense of how to read Tagore. Historians, some very, very learned historians say, oh, we can't read his language. I mean, it's just too much. And that's just a mode. It's a rhetorical mode. So you have to know how to read that language, and Okakura's as well. I think that Tagore is not fully, he's not theorizing this tension, I would say, between the national and nationalism. He's not, you know, but it's there. I'll give you a lovely example. In one of his, I think in Creative Unity, where he's talking about, he's in his room and a Chantal, a tribal woman comes in, and she's over there, and the gardener is sweeping the petals, and he's, you know, just brushing them into his basket. And she stops him and he said, "What are you doing?" You know? And she says, "You only," and then of course he's probably improvising on what he thinks she's saying about him. He says, "You're only writing all the time," you know? And she takes the petals and she puts it to her forehead, you know, and she blesses it. And he says, "That is the spirit of India." I mean, it's an amazing kind of illumination, how he goes from petals into spirit of India, you know. But that's obviously working in a very poetic and a very spiritual kind of mode. And when it's acknowledged, it's always seen as some kind of, oh, that's poetic, that's an excrescence, that's an excess, that's an indulgence, you know. We don't take it seriously, that's poetic. That's the problem, I think. And that's why I think one of the best things that has ever come close to theorizing this, and I recommend it to everyone, is Ranajit Guha's wonderful book on history at the limit of world history, where, you know, Ranajit Guha, for those who may not know him, is one of the great thinkers, the leader, the founder of the Subaltern Studies group. And he was a man steeped in Marx and Hegel and Gramsci and all of that. And towards the end of his life, he's talking about history at the limit of world history. And he's trying to envision another history. And who does he turn to? Tagore. He turns to Tagore. You know? And that's why many of his own disciples, most renowned academics, are not able to cope with that. So it's not just Ranajit Guha. There are two other people who are able to come very close to disentangling the national from nationalism. Frantz Fanon and Stuart Hall. Both of them were aware of this tension. And it seems to me that in an age of seething with nationalisms of the worst kind, we cannot afford to give up on the national. We have to define, we have to imagine the national for ourselves. And that's the role artists have to play, you know. Now, I was in Australia, I'm sorry, my mind is, but I'm giving you I was in Australia working with a multicultural group of artists from many different parts of the world, but they're all Australians. They're Vietnamese Australian, Polish Australian, Chinese Australian, etc., etc. And what struck me as an outsider to that context was that every single one of those artists wanted to claim Australia in his or her own way. They all had an investment in that Australia, you know, through their own biographies or whatever. And all of them were against the kind of nationalism being put forward by John Howard, who was at that time, who was the most virulent kind of, should we say, rejecter of hospitality, the codes of hospitality. You know, he wanted to get, you know what his record is there. And I was very struck by that because I said, my God, there's something going on here. And these guys are national in their own right, although we don't like to use that word. You know what I mean? Because we'd like to go under many other kinds of labels which are cooler or less fraught. And there's reason to be, you know, wary of this. But I don't believe you can fight nationalism if you abandon the national. I really would say that. But how you imagine the national, that's the task of our times. And because it cannot be imagined by one person, by a multitude. Yes?
Irid.
First of all, thank you for all this nuanced complexity, which is really welcome. I have a question that I don't quite know how to articulate, so bear with me. And it's to do with the multiple burdens on the sort of figures that you've kind of brought to the foreground, in terms of the fact that they are addressing several audiences simultaneously. And which is the burden of those who don't come from hegemonic positions and universalist languages. So if you're speaking from the West to the West, etc., you occupy both a hegemonic position and a universalist language. But there is a series of layers of burden when you come from elsewhere and are speaking beyond your place, which is, first of all, the burden to represent the full complexity of the place you come from, the burden to make it legitimate as a general principle, in the same way that the West is a general principle, the burden to represent a kind of local legitimacy internationally. I once saw Gayatri Spivak and Mahashvata Devi performing pure nativism in an international context. And I was with Kumari Jayawardena, and she said to me, they're not speaking to you. They're speaking to the people in Bengal, right? So it's them they have to convince about the fact that they have...
Where did you hear them?
At the Marxist Literary Group, which I was part of. In London? No, this was in Pittsburgh, a long time ago.
Long time ago, in Pittsburgh.
But the sort of that sort of sense of audience behind audience behind audience in a kind of endless layering, and which you get up and speak and you have to produce 6 or 7 persuasive, operations simultaneously. And I got, in a sort of very delicate way, I got the sense of that from you. But I'm wondering if you could say more about the burden part of it.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much for that very deep reflection. Well, take myself, I travel. I've been lecturing. This is my last lecture. I've been from Taiwan. I went to Mannheim. I went to Tangier and then London, and I gave a lecture on terror yesterday, and today I'm talking about Tagore and Okakura. It's a big burden. I mean, it's a tremendous toll on the body. That's the first thing. That, you have to somehow hold yourself together. You have to somehow hold that together, the discourse together. You have to be strategic about how you are likely to be read, in different spaces. Like, for example, if I'm talking about something very explosively political, the subject of terror, of course, lends itself to that. I have to be a little circumspect about how certain contexts, may not be familiar to my audience, so I have to indicate it, inform them without, kind of beating them on the head. But returning the question to Tagore and Okakura, I think Tagore's audacity lies in the fact that he was not doing this. He was not doing this. I mean, we're on our toes, because this is our condition. We have to be. And you might say, why was he not doing this? Because believe me, the political context of Japan between the Meiji and the Taisho period, he's actually in the Taisho period when he comes to Japan. It's hugely complex in terms of politics, in terms of economics, in terms of women's rights, in terms of, all kinds of things, discourses on race. Why was he not, you might say, better informed, And I'm trying very hard to, how much had he read about this? And this is where, that's why I spent a little bit of time focusing on performativity and discourse. Because we guys, we have to be very, very shrewd about the discourse of our times, and the several discourses that function in different locations, I think Tagore just didn't get it. Or he just he thought he could just, with his will and desire, and I'm going back to what I'd said about why Judith Butler's position there is important. It's my voice, it's what I believe Asia should be, etc. And that misfired, very seriously misfired, Now, Okakura, we don't have anything like lectures that he gave because he was more of a social figure. He was being entertained. He was in very, very big parties, Isabella Gardner, Fenway Court, and Art World, etc. But we get correspondence, a lot of correspondence. Okakura strikes me as being a lot more savvy, about how you speak to your hosts and your potential benefactors. And sometimes he spoke very ruthless, like he's speaking like an American. He's not just an American friend. He is talking American. So like when they're exchanging telegrams and about money, he just has one word, more. More. I mean, come on, then you're already speaking another language. You're not speaking in this grandiloquent, enigmatic Asian way in haikus or whatever. You're just saying more. You're just saying more. I want more money. And I think I feel I like him in an odd way because I see he's the forerunner of so many people who are today absolutely like rats in this larger trap called the art world, if I may put it bluntly. And it's all about the funding. It's all about, who you know and how you, make the contacts. It's pretty vicious. He is the forerunner. He is the forerunner. And I don't know if in the book, there's a lot of evidence of, but what is a bit chilling is how because recently Museum of Fine Arts had a collaboration with Museum of Fine Arts Nagoya, and there was this tie-up between them. And it seemed as if nothing had changed. There was no acknowledgement of this history. It was just partnership, So you're entering into another phase of global capitalism, I think with Tagore also economics plays a role. Look, if he's getting $700 per lecture, it's a lot of money, okay? He needed the money for his school. Without that money, he couldn't have run his school, So we do this all the time. Sometimes, many people from my part of the world, when you subject yourself to these things, it's sometimes just survival, and it becomes a trap. Gandhi did not like this aspect of Tagore. There's a wonderful picture photograph of Gandhi. I'd love to just analyze that late in life. And Gandhi and his dear wife, Kasturba, are there. And Tagore is a little away, and he's garlands and garlands, and it looks like he's burdened with chains, And and Gandhi is kind of looking at him from the side, like accusingly. And Tagore is averting his gaze like this. And basically, and Kasturba is the only one looking straight ahead. She's got no secrets to hide. She's wonderful in that photograph. And basically, if I had to add a blurb, like in a comic strip, to that thing, I'd say, why does he go around with a begging bowl? That's what he had accused Tagore of, going around with a begging bowl. You know, and sadly, that sometimes happens even today, you know, in different forms. And, you know, so I would say, to answer your question, yes, the burdens of addressing different audiences. If Tagore had taken that more seriously, he might not have been misunderstood as he was. He was deep, he played into misunderstanding. In China, it was disastrous. He was saying all the wrong things, you know? I mean, look, if you are invited anywhere, like today I was talking to Grant, I won't go into all the details. I was uncovering the history of Iniva, okay? And the history of Iniva in relation to the Black Art movement and, you know, funding and all of that. It's a complex history, you know? So no space comes without that complexity. Now, if I had known, I had some knowledge, but, you know, maybe that could have changed some of the wording of what I'm saying to you. I might have added certain things here, you know? It might have just come into my, because I'm strategic, or I try to be strategic. But I think in Tagore's case, it just didn't seem to impinge. And that was a problem. So both in Japan and in China, receptions were dreadful. And it's something we don't always acknowledge.
I want to maybe raise something a little less profound and complex and come back to poor Thomas Mann's vanity. who, after all, he got the Nobel Prize first. You know, 10 years before Tagore, I think.
He did.
But, so he could expect Tagore to know. But I think this thing of comparing him to, comparing to an old English
lady,
yes.
An old English lady.
Yes, it's kind of interesting because in some sense, he knows what he's talking about. And it comes back to this thing of how Tagore has this kind of innocence, which you're talking about. And listening to that recording of Tagore's voice, it reminds me of something from the English theatre of that period.
Yeah.
So if you listen to, say, someone like Max Beerbohm Tree on the recording,
to
be or not to be,
yeah.
You know, he takes as long to say to be or not to be as an actor now does through the whole speech.
Yes.
And Tagore's right in that.
He is in that. He is in that mode.
And
but I think the one thing
is this Forsterian moment you were talking about.
Yeah, but I think what is for me, I think that's absolutely accurate. It could also be seen in the context of a sort of an elocutionary culture, a sort of a declamatory elocutionary culture, and many people who've heard the recording say, "Oh, that's I can pick out that colonized voice, you know, that has been taught to speak English in this very." But for me, what is astonishing is not, it's just the last part. It's the way it kind of goes into this other rhetorical mode where he starts chanting. And I found that when I heard it, at least the first time, was quite daring. You know, I mean, I can't imagine anyone doing that, you know, today. I mean, in a you know, just going into this, you know, full-blooded, you know, kind of either a song or something, I think we wouldn't be able to do it, number one. We wouldn't know how to do it. We wouldn't have the voice training for that. But also it would be a little over the top.
But is it liturgical as well?
It's liturgical, yes. It's got those inflections. Yeah, those are very... But I was very interested in... I'm interested in syntax. And, you know, one of the things about Tagore's sentences in English, when I was in my book, In the Name of the Secular, there was this long sentence I had of Tagore against communalism and whatever we're facing in India today. It's an amazing sentence, and my not very bright editor said, "Should we cut it? And should we, you know, put full stops?" I said, "No, you won't. You know, that's the punctuation. That's this, you know, this commas, you know, this sort of cascading, you know, kind of effect. That's Bengali. That's the fluidity of the language. And it's in the voice as well. Where is the breath? You know, you're trying to say, where's his breath coming from?" So I was very intrigued by that recording. And I must say, in a more pragmatic register, it wasn't easy for me to get that recording. You know, so even now, copyright issues and all those things, it's in Humboldt. I heard it in Calcutta. The man played it there. I loved it. I wanted it, and he says, no, it's not available. And then I really had to negotiate that. I said, I'm not using it for commercial purposes or whatever. But yeah, the voice is... Tagore was often ridiculed on account of his voice. Tagore was subjected to a lot of cruelty by his own people. Effeminacy, high-pitched falsetto, you know, all of that is there. It's a very treble, it's a very, very high register, you know. But he just didn't budge from, you know, he just tried to be true to himself, you know, in his own way. Yeah. I think there was somebody here and then there was somebody.
Thank you, Rustom. I wanted to maybe just, if you could continue on this aspect of the national in Tagore and Fanon, because actually there's this quote where Tagore literally uses the term wretchedness. And
I don't know, where does he do this?
When he was in Iran.
Achha.
And he talks about wretchedness in Europe, and this that burden turns into a sort of, in some sense, a decolonial language. And also in terms of what Irit was saying in terms of the burden, I was wondering whether that sort of, in a way, even self-involved burden of Tagore, especially when he's talking about rural service, which is how he puts his Sri Niketan period, as rural service. And he's basically saying there are two wrongs that I'm carrying. One, that I'm a poet, and one, that I'm rich.
Yeah.
And that burden of him as the landlord poet was something
another
that
kind
we
of
were...
burden.
another kind of burden, and it's something that
there's
we
a
were
word that's coming to my mind. He compared himself to contraband, you know, smuggled goods, you know. He said, to get back to your question, he said, I'm misunderstood there, I'm misunderstood here, you know. This whole business, he's not a good translator. I mean, I get back to, this is a very interesting point. Tagore really didn't take translation seriously. This is a real problem, you know. His translations are atrocious. They're distortions of his own work. He cuts entire things off. At one level, it was pragmatic because he needed money. So Macmillan, it's again the book industry. Macmillan signed the contract and all of that. And it was a sad thing for him to do because he lost the respect of his greatest admirers, notably Yeats and Ezra Pound. It was Yeats and Ezra Pound who actually were probably behind his winning the way I find that astonishing. That tells you how does the Nobel Prize win. You know, the man goes across in 1 year, he gets a Nobel Prize. I mean, how does it work? What are the mechanics? It took many years for Yeats to get the Nobel Prize, you know. So in terms of Fanon, it's his essay on national culture, which I'm referring to. It's in 2 of my books. I'm afraid there's not much elaboration. And also in Stuart Hall, I think perhaps Stuart probably got it from Frantz Fanon, but you know, if he were here, you would say, please tell us more, you know. But it is national consciousnness, which is not nationalism. There's a final sentence, is what is going to give us something, and it leads to like a culture for all, you know. It's going to move beyond these national boundaries. So that very, Fanon, as you know, was deeply prescient of what would happen to nationalism in the post-independence period. But it was not sufficiently sifted. So he has an essay, for example, you know, The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. So once again, he's falling back. National consciousness is getting once again subsumed within nationalism. You know what I mean? So that, you know, in theory, you have to inflect, you have to discriminate, and that's why categories become very important. You know, and otherwise, yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Gee, sorry.
Well, it's in my head. I want to just talk a little bit about this sense of self-orientalizing that you were describing. It's something a term I've been using for a long time, to describe all kinds of situations that I've noticed in art practice, in cultural practice, in this country and in others. But what I'm kind of interested in is this question of becoming. You described your Australian group of multicultural collaborators, artists you were working with. I mean, in London, in Britain, there are obviously many people from all over the world who live here and who have lived here. Some have been born here, like myself, and you know, we are obviously part of. It's easier for us than it is, say, for new migrants coming into this country. But it's not. I mean, it's not easier for us in a way. But what I actually want to sort of focus on is this question of self-orientalizing in relation to how we have been, as a kind of condition that one is that you were describing so beautifully with these guys, that they're kind of using, they're sort of playful in many ways with it, which is also becomes a burden, which also becomes they can act like kind of Trojan horses in a way, or like smugglers. That's all very interesting, and I think what we are doing here is analysing these complexities in a very interesting way. But what I see in the art world now is this other kind of layer of sort of biennale culture, where you just have this redistribution, where there's this belief that we all live in this silly global world. Maybe it's because of the internet, maybe it's because of this kind of political apathy in general, where you have the distribution of all these artists from different parts of the world, but actually very little focus on artists from these migrants and earlier immigrants like myself, my family, in people who've been first generation, second generation, newly arrived. There is a very little focus on those people within this, because there is this sense that we have now represented the international. In these big institutions, we've represented African artists, Indian artists. We've got authentic artists in our curatorial portfolio, and basically we don't need to think about our responsibility to people of colour in Britain and in Europe. And it's something I'm just seeing that's happening. More and more. This complete kind of negation of their presence.
I think that in today's art world, at least from what I know of it, the globalizing imperatives are such, and the social networking is such, that to self-orientalize yourself, I think, would be somewhat counterproductive. That could be counterproductive, and that what really is that you play into the global script, so of a certain global cosmopolitanism. So you know the reference points, and you. So for somebody, then self-orientalization could take on a different political register altogether. I mean, I don't think she would like me to say this, but since she's not around, and I hope this will not be included in the recording, if we studied Gayatri Spivak, I mean, she's one of the biggest performers that we have in the academic world, there's no question. How she presents herself sartorially and linguistically with this extraordinary assemblage of voice, which has still got the Bengali accent, and it's still got all the the thrust, the full discursive thrust of postmodernity and so on, and the sari at the same time. Very interesting. In some ways, an audacity is at work there, I would say, definitely. She's not trying to conform. She's not going to be your conventional native. She's not going to be that, but she's not going to abandon those signs entirely. She's going to play with those signs in her own configuration. And in that sense, there's something quite bold about that kind of, I would say, performance, although it can be very difficult at times. But I think that today, perhaps the norm is anonymization. So if you're going into like sartorially, what would you dress? You wear black, because that's the most, you just get, you pass, you just enter that world, it's sad. So all these registers, I don't think are necessarily negative registers. They can be read in, depending on location and context and time, they can all take it. All performances, and self-orientalization is a performance, can be read in different ways, and they can have different intensities.
Thank you for that really multifaceted exploration of Tagore's relationships and his oeuvre. I wonder if I might quickly comment on, you've used the word audacity. When you said that Tagore wasn't very strategic, I was wondering whether, perhaps partly out of naivete, or perhaps partly even because of this burden of being the landlord poet, whether he was, whether that was his own subversiveness, saying, basically saying, I shan't play to your audiences. Yeah. I shall be true to myself. Yeah. Yeah. But my question was really about, I was fascinated by your semiotic analysis of his photographic portraits. And I was wondering, looking at the one with his aquiline nose and the other one with the Japanese women sitting in Berlin, whether in his preference for composed studio portraits and his dislike of candid photographs, yes, whether he was participating in his own hagiography, yes, or whether it was his attempt to exercise control over his image in his own sort of celebrity performer world.
Very nice comment. Yeah, it is that. If you see he is controlling his representation, how is he being seen. He doesn't like accidental or aleatory kinds of, as in our jargon today. No, that won't do with him. So there are very studied portraits. So you'll have the architecture of, say, a mud house, which he had built in Shantiniketan, and he is in the window, and he's writing. I mean, there is a performance going on there. Come on, there is, if you have to, hold a pen in your hand and, stare in the, this is not exactly Shah Rukh Khan doing something, but it's like, there is a studied portraiture, and so I think maybe if one deepened this a little more, portraiture would have to be opened up. And what is portraiture? What does it really do? And I am fascinated by the fact that he went to many studios and got photographed. Now, I'm curious, like the Vienna shot. I don't really know why or how he got there. In that, I certainly don't think if you're on a lecture tour that you're going to go into a studio and get your shot. Maybe a passport photo if you run out of passport photos, or you need some card or the other. So one thing I noticed, if you go into closer analysis of photography, which I haven't done here, he didn't like being touched.
That's why I'm wondering whether it was more complex than that. On the one hand, he seems an anti-careerist. On the other hand, there's this
he's a careerist.
Himself and
he's a careerist.
A complex relationship with his own body, perhaps.
He's very, very clear of his. Yeah, he's. I think it's also a different. Well, if in certain Bengali society, there's a lot of touch. There's certainly homosocial intimacy abounds in many ways, but I felt. When you study the photographs, you actually see spaces, and there's actually a withdrawal, a slight withdrawal. He liked his solitude. I think, and yes, that's part of a certain image, whether he's playing into a world image or this is how he had to, live. This is how he had to survive. He's a complex, deeply beautiful human being, I feel, but he comes with his own complexities, and perhaps there is also vanity there of another kind. You can't deny that, like somebody like Jiddu Krishnamurti, for example. Oh, that's somebody to study. Really study Krishnamurti's performance, and, the hair and, how he was very conscious, television, and very conscious of the camera, I would say. So I like your point very much, that he was contributing towards his hagiography in a certain way, trying to control it in a certain way. And that's why I think the final moment when the body is exposed, when you see those public shots of his body, I find those really painful. And of course, there are a lot of stories around how, his hair, and people were plucking. He was actually, the body was being clawed. That's violence. But that's exactly idolatry. That's what he was trying to work against. And that's what Partho Chatterjee, who has a more caustic approach to Tagore than I do, and of course he reveres Tagore and all that, but he doesn't take Tagore seriously as, providing any kind of, insights into the kinds of national look. He would say, no, this is where it stops, And he has this very ironic writing about how Tagore ultimately is subjected to, in a certain idolatry, deification. I mean, it's very moving. If you go to his room where he died, it's really hard not to cry. It's very, very hard. And you don't know why that is the case or what is the case. But things are changing also, It's not the same anymore. So this is one person speaking, Today, Rabindranath Tagore is now being heard in different contexts of politics, in different contexts of it's on mobile phones, and it's a different resonance.
I've had time to freak myself out about this. Don't like public speaking. Anyway, and I've forgotten what I was going to say. Something to do with national consciousness, which is not nationalism.
Yeah.
And I think I remember that essay, I think it's The Afterlife of Frantz Fanon in The Fact of Blackness, that book that was published by the ICA. And as an almost exact mirror of that essay, at the end of that book, Homi Bhabha sort of quotes that paragraph and does weird things with it. And I'm kind of... my thesis is about national identity and looking at Bhabha, and I wonder whether, part of the debate, I guess, is what would sort of the national look like without nationalism, and where does national identity, and, what you were talking about in terms of the spirit of India, which is a fairly problematic space, really, just in terms of, one in the sense of a kind of exotic India, but in another sense, the way that exotic is actually being harnessed by, talk about the Holy Land and this pure region of the Hindus, and how these different things.
I think it's, you're raising, I don't share Homi Bhabha's views entirely. I think that Homi, I think that it was very important to have. See, the basic in post-colonial theory or in postmodernism, it's almost platitudinous to say that we developed there were certain kinds of taboos, there were certain kinds of aversions, there were certain kinds of things you didn't engage with. They were our bogies, And I think with good reason, I'm not going to undermine that. I certainly think nationalism is virulent and something that can destroy. I'm certainly no nationalist in that sense. But I think we have to rethink our strategies here. And likewise, the huge, all the students and all will come up with, that's an essentialization. And they say, that's an essentialization. I said, and do you think you can think without essentializing? Is it possible to think at some level without essentializing? So yes, indeed, the spirit of India can be read as some kind of a massive essentialism or playing into, but I feel that if we play all the time into the fears of appropriation or into the fears of a certain kind of, this is how you're playing into Hindutva, you are actually weakening your position here. And you can say, sorry, when he is talking about that woman who is picking up the flowers and putting it to her forehead and saying, spirit of my heart or whatever, it's not playing into what the RSS would be saying about Bharatvarsha and Janma Bhumi and Punya Bhumi. It's not that. It's not that discourse at all. And we, as critics, we have to be able to discriminate between that and say, I reject this, but I think there's something going on here that is beautiful. And that, I think, is something we are not yet ready for. We are still realizing that all languages need to be tweaked and subverted and, and not made formulaic. So whether it's Bertolt Brecht or it's Homi Bhabha or whoever, those categories which had a kind of radical pertinence at a certain point in time within certain frameworks, I think have to be reworked today. And likewise, therefore, Edward Said, though my whole paper is sort of handled lightly because of the larger frame of this lecture, But yes, Edward Said, whom I revere and I am absolutely influenced by, but I realized that you cannot canonize that reading of Oriental. It was written in 78, you know. Let's get that and respect it for what it is. It holds up remarkably well. I would never say that that argument on Orientalism is gone, no. But I think it needs complications and complexities, and, you know, it's like all discourses. You know, we leave things out, we try to, you know, get our point across, etc. But time passes and you say, yeah, maybe it could be seen in this way too.
Thanks. Rustom, thanks for an amazing lecture. And so I think I want to say something about methodology.
Yeah.
Your methodology and in the wider context of the research project that this is part of. It seems very interesting to me that we started this research project on Tagore 7 months ago, and this is the final event of the whole process, and it is only at this point that we engage in such a direct manner, if you will, with the body of Tagore and the literature of Tagore. Although many of us, in all sorts of ways, are engaging with many of the details of the work. I'm looking at Landings over here, of course, but also, you know, everybody that's involved in the project brings different specialisms. So it seems to me very interesting that this methodological process we've followed, which has been shooting in many, many different directions, has been very clearly grasping with some of the terms that you bring up in Another Asia, No Nation, also the concept of cosmopolitics that, you know, is a very important part of one of the chapters towards the end. And yet it is only at this point that we actually bring the body of Tagore into the room effectively in such a kind of clear way. And I wondered, and of course when Grant and I wrote the application for the funding for this project, I think we both in different ways, maybe we're kind of concerned about even naming it Tagore in a way. What does it mean to name something Tagore, or to try and depart from a figure who contains all the complexities that you and the questions from the audience are clearly indicating? So I guess my question is one of methodology, which is related very clearly to the questions of hagiography that have just been mentioned, which is how do we go forward with these figures? How do we continue to understand them? How do you, as a researcher, I mean, obviously you've laid out your methodology very clearly here today, but what is the future, if you will, of God. These? No, I don't want to ask it in a very big way. In a kind of much more detailed way, I guess.
I think.
How do we deal with these figures?
Well, Gandhi, for example, is very much on my mind.
Well, you talked about Gandhi yesterday as well.
Gandhi is hugely important for me today, and I have a student at the moment who is doing her MPhil dissertation, and it's interesting when the impulse comes from students, and she's studying the performativity, the different performative behaviors of Gandhi and Ambedkar, and in different political events. And I like, in my book on terror, I deal with, of course, Gandhi's corporeality and how central the body was for Gandhi, very central. And indeed, artists who work on Gandhi's figure, I have a sculptor friend from South Africa, Andreas Botha, and who has sculpted Nelson Mandela, among other figures. He does avant-garde kind of experimental work, but he also likes national sculptures. He likes doing that, because it's in the public domain and all that. And he was, like an artist would say, my God, I was so thrilled and stunned, because there's this image of Gandhi with his bare chest, and a microphone is against the breast, as it were. And that image of the steel and the chest, he said, for me as a sculptor, that does so much, for me. And now, this kind of insight is more likely to come from an artist. It's not scholars who would pick up on these things, and they probably wouldn't know what to do with these things. I think we need to, because my area is in performance, so performance deals with body, it deals with voice, it deals with feelings, it deals with emotions. So I see things, you know, like an actor would see certain things. So for me, that exchange between Tagore and Okakura over the clay pot is like a scene for me. That's, you know, I actually see that. Although I couldn't authenticate where it was taking place. I did my work as a researcher and I would say, could it have been here? Could it have been here? When could it have done? And then I realized, no, I can't place it like a historian would, you know, want you to say, when did it happen? And, you know, what was it a mela that they were in, or was it this or that? I don't know. It's the concreteness of the gesture. It's the resonance of the gesture. So I think that one is to open ourselves more to corporeality, embodiment, affect, gesturality. These are dimensions, and movement. It seems, at least in my field, in the theory, it's certainly becoming more and more important. And whenever students today, many of my students are now coming up with very wonderful, it's all coming from them, we're not telling them what to do. One of my bright students, she's working on the campus as performance, you know, campus as the actual Delhi University campus with graffiti and, you know, spaces and all of that. And my devil's advocate kind of position is always, but what is performative about this? I'll always say a sociology department can do this, or a history department can do this. What are you bringing to this analysis that you can claim is performative? That is, I think, instead of taking the performative for granted in that sense. So on the one hand, there's the expressive, there's the gestural and all of that, but there's also the discursive, you know, dimensions, which comes with performativity, and that came through, you know, when I was dealing with truth and reconciliation yesterday, and how truth and reconciliation becomes a performance, but it becomes a performance at one level through people crying and all of that, but also through what people say, you know. And so it's just, I don't know how it works in the art world, because I don't specifically deal with the art world. But in terms of the figures that you're talking about, well, you can't canonize them. You can't play into iconicization or whatever. Hagiography is another. But it's important we don't dismiss hagiography. It's important that we learn how to read it. I think that's an importance. It's another discursive mode. Like at the moment, I'm working on Ramakrishna, and Ramakrishna, what exists around Ramakrishna could be said a hagiographic text, but it's a miraculous text at many other levels. So you have to know how to read the epithets, the resonances, you know, I think it's, so reading does become important, but I don't think that's enough. What else can one say? You know, how do these figures live today? You know, what's their resonance? Are they just statues and posters and, you know, images, or are they? How do they live in people's hearts? You know.
How do you think Tagore will be read today in today's India?
It depends on which part of India you're in. Sadly, figures like Tagore, if you had to take that amazing, what he was talking about, the Himalayas of India and the Ganga and the Jamuna, and, you know, in that, it was hard for you, and he was quoting Buddha and Kabir and, you know, the Bhakti traditions, and not by force, you know, but, you know, all of that. That language would be very remote for most people today. I mean, if you're in hardcore, real political sense, it would be laughed at, it would be ridiculed, you know. He's out of sync completely, in a sense. But there are other people, small minority maybe, who are beginning to say, we need him, you know, we need to read him again. You know, I have a dancer friend who was just talking to in Berlin, a Sikh, and he says, yes, it's Tagore that, you know, may provide some sanity or some balance. But I don't think we can, figures Tagore, people wouldn't know how to...
But it can't be appropriated the way Vivekananda...
No, no, no. It would be very hard to appropriate. In fact, Tagore has been subjected to rejections and shelving aside, so even, in the left-front government in West Bengal at one time decided not to, have Tagore in their primary schools. I mean, there were some textbook kinds of decisions, all political decisions, but I think that for Bengalis, he will certainly live at a he will continue to be a habitus, but that's Bengal. Now, how that extends in the diasporic world, I'm not in a position to say, but something has been internalized, and when something is internalized, I don't believe it can die. I believe it may have, ebbs and flows, but it cannot die. There may be a low point, but I don't believe it's obliterated. I don't think. Okakura is more intriguing, like Tagore. We've talked a lot about Tagore. I feel a deep affinity to Okakura in a worldly way. I feel we're all players a bit like Okakura. He reminds us of who we are with all our frailties and cunning. But he's an endearing man. He's a very warm and endearing man. I don't see him in a conniving sense. I think there's a heart there. The big-hearted Japanese thinker is what Tagore says, and I would go with that.
Thank you, Rustom. I think on that note we'll end, and thank you very much, everybody, for your great questions and engagement in the talk.
Thank you. It's wonderful. Thank you.